Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the Latino Podcast Listener Report. I'm Gabe Soto from Edison Research.
And I'm Martina Castro, CEO of Adonde Media. We are both so excited to deliver the first ever in-depth study of Latino podcast listeners.
Yes, and thanks to our partners, Adonde Media, Lantigua Williams Company, Libsyn, NPR, and Pandora, we were able to not only bring this study to life, but also make it available to podcasters, producers, and anyone involved in the Latino podcasting space.
We have some really interesting findings we want to share with you, like how much time Latinos spend with podcasts,
What percentage of Latinos have even listened to a podcast, and what services they use to listen.
We're also very happy to be bringing you these results from people who listen in English and in Spanish.
Yep, a lot of topics to cover today. If any of you have questions during the presentations, we have members of the Edison Research team online with us who can answer your questions in the Q&A window if you're joining us live. And you can always email info@edisonresearch.com with questions after this webinar has been published.
Before we launch into the presentation, we'd like to explain the methodology behind the studies we're going to reference.
To supplement the Latino Podcast Listener Report, we're going to draw from the Edison's share of ear data, where a nationally representative sample of the U.S. population keeps an online diary of what they're listening to.
This goes beyond the Latino Podcast Listener Report because it measures how much time people listen to audio, and more importantly for us, podcasts.
And to dig in deep into that podcast listening among Latinos, we conducted an online survey of 2,500 adults who identified as Hispanic or Latino. The study fielded in May, and it was weighted to the population figures of the U.S. Census. This study is the Latino Podcast Listener Report. So let's start with our share of ear data. One of our biggest findings in share of ear is that Latinos spend an average of 4 hours and 34 minutes per day listening to audio. That's 44 more minutes in comparison to the total population. So how is this time divided up by the kinds of audio that Latinos listen to? These graphs represent audio listening time, and on the right, we see Latinos spend 19% of their audio time with spoken word audio. The remaining audio time goes to music. This split is similar to that of the total populations on the left.
And because Latinos spend more time with audio to begin with, that 19% ends up being just about the same average time listening to spoken word audio each day as the total population.
Now let's zoom in on that spoken word audio section in blue. This tells us that 22% of the time Latinos spent with spoken word audio comes from podcasts.
The takeaway here is that, and this is significant, is that the share of time spent listening to podcasts is higher among Latinos than the U.S. total population.
So why do Latinos spend more of their average time with podcasts? Who are they, and what more do we know about their podcast listening in English and in Spanish?
Well, Gabe, as you know, before this study, we did not know much at all. This really is the first time anyone is digging into listening trends among Latinos, especially in both languages.
Yep, and thanks to you, Martina, and other sponsors of this study, we were able to conduct the Latino Podcast Listener Report to answer some of these very important questions. So these figures hereafter are from the Latino Podcast Listener Report, unless otherwise indicated.
We want to kick off with some demographic data about who answered the study. As you can see, Latinos tend to be younger.
Yep, and these pies now represent the percentage of people. So 40% of Latinos overall are between the ages of 18 and 34, as you see on the right. That's a 9-point difference compared to the proportion of 18 to 34-year-olds of the overall adult U.S. population on the left.
This is important because we know that from Edison's other research, younger people consume more audio and spend more of their time with podcasts on average.
Exactly, Martina, just as we saw in the previous share of ear data for Latinos.
Another important characteristic we want to point out is birthplace. So a third of Latinos were born outside of the U.S. This includes Puerto Rico, while the remaining 2/3 were born in the U.S.
This is important because the listening habits of the two-thirds born in the US will be the major driver of the US listening habits of the overall Latino group, just based solely on its size. And yes, there are differences between these groups, which we'll see later on.
And the final characteristic of Latinos that we want to mention is language usage. This is a comparison of Spanish versus English usage at home. A little more than a third of Latinos only or mostly use Spanish at home. We consider these Latinos Spanish dominant. In contrast, 2/3 of Latinos are not Spanish dominant. These are the Latinos who say they use both languages equally, or those that mostly or only use English at home. We'll also compare these two groups later on.
Now on to what we really came here for, the almighty podcast stats. These upcoming figures will provide context on how far along we are as podcast listeners and how far we have to go. Here's a comparison of the total population versus Latinos. The dark blue bar is data from the Infinite Dial 2020, which is a phone survey, and it includes everyone, even those without internet access. It indicates that 3/4 of the total population have ever heard of the term podcasting. Using it as a benchmark, we recognize that Latinos lag behind in the familiarity of the term podcasting. The light blue bar is data from the Latino Podcast Listener Report, which is an online study. This indicates that 61% of Latinos say they are aware of the term. And we would expect a higher number for an online study, but the fact that it isn't suggests an even greater lag.
Now, by breaking out Latinos based on language dominance, like we saw earlier, we come across a really interesting finding here. There's an incredibly large 22-point gap in awareness of the term podcasting between non-Spanish dominant Latinos and the Spanish dominant group, of which less than half say they're familiar with the term.
And there's an even greater difference between the US-born Latinos and Latinos who were born outside of the US mainland. The gap here is 28 points.
But how many Latinos have actually listened to a podcast before?
Once again, in dark blue, the Infinite Dial 2020 report tells us that over half of the total population versus 45% of the Latino population have at one point in their lifetime listened to a podcast.
Interestingly here, the listening gap isn't quite as large as the awareness gap in the previous slide, even when you compare the language dominant groups to one another, and same goes for those born in and out of the US.
Take note here that the percentage of podcast listeners fails to surpass the halfway mark for Latinos across these demographics. So we encourage everyone listening to this webinar to use this report and to keep pushing until more than half of Latinos report ever listening to a podcast. Martina said she'll have a party when we reach that milestone.
That is absolutely 100% true. And if you're asking yourself if these podcasts are in English or Spanish, then here is the difference. 36% of Latinos have ever listened to a podcast that was mostly in English, and 24% have ever listened to one that was mostly in Spanish. I have to say these two figures are closer than I had imagined, which is really nice. We'll compare differences in language listening groups among monthly listeners a little bit later on.
And these monthly listeners, the monthly listening audience for the entire country has doubled in the past 5 years. Today, 37% of all adults listen to podcasts monthly in comparison to 1/4 of Latino adults who listen to podcasts monthly. The Latino number reflects what the proportion was for the total population in 2017. So we're starting to see a theme here, a theme that Latinos are lagging behind a bit.
Looking at this by language dominance, there's no difference. And there's only a minimal difference if we look at Latino monthly podcast listeners by birthplace.
And weekly listening is an area where Latino adults lag, but less intensely. You can see the 3-point difference between the total is less significant. But please remember the comparison is between phone and online methodologies. So while it does provide context, it suggests a greater lag for Latinos.
And we continue to see minimal differences among the two language dominant groups and those born in or outside the US. But we do see differences when it comes to awareness versus listening.
Exactly. And here's a summary of the different levels of podcast listening and awareness of the term podcasting to show that. So, in order to explain, I'll use the pillar for the total population all the way to the left. From bottom to top, the pillar demonstrates percentage of weekly podcast listeners in orange. Like we saw in the previous slide, that's 23%. If you add that to the 14% in red, you get all monthly podcast listeners, which is 37%. Add the 15 in green, and that is everyone who has ever listened. And the blue, those are the people who are aware of the term but have never listened to a podcast. Adding these groups together shows 75% of the total population is familiar with the term podcasting. Now, here's the story.
When we look at Latinos who live in Spanish-dominant households, we see that weekly, monthly, and general listenership is up to par with their counterparts that do not live in Spanish-dominant households. The remarkable difference here is in awareness of the term podcasting. Spanish-dominant Latinos are less likely to be aware of the term, but they're just as likely to be listeners.
It's something to be optimistic about, that there's a strong upside here and a great opportunity. You know, if we go out and start telling the primos, who start telling the comadres, who start telling la vecina about podcasts, and we can probably expect at least some rise in listening as they begin to find out about podcasting.
Exactly. I think it's a really, really, really good sign.
Martina, and I want to point out those who are aware of podcasts but have never listened to one. We asked them why they haven't, and many of the reasons point to a lack of understanding and a lack of content. They said things like podcasts are too long, that you have to pay to subscribe to podcasts, which we know both of those aren't true. But this isn't about us. It's about the potential listener. It's clear that many don't quite understand what a podcast is or how you can even listen to one. A good 28% said they're not sure how to listen. Lack of content is also an issue because another popular reason mentioned was that there simply aren't podcasts that cover the topics they're interested in. Which brings me to the concept of the show. It's the idea that Tom Webster has mentioned, that every platform, whether it's radio, TV, and now podcasts, every platform needs a show that will have Latinos talking enough about it to create a desire for other Latinos to listen.
And we might need more than one show because, as we're going to see today, the term Latino refers to a very diverse group of people who have very diverse interests in terms of what they want to listen to, by whom, and where they even find it.
So, how about we start there? The diversity of the Latino demographic. Let's talk about the demographics of Latino monthly podcast listeners.
Yes, let's do that because this is 25% of all U.S. Latino adults. Let's find out more about who they are.
U.S. Latino monthly podcast listeners skew male, and this 55 to 45 split is reminiscent of the gender split for the total U.S. monthly podcast listening audience in 2017.
Now, if Latinos are young, Latino monthly podcast listeners are even younger. 18 to 34-year-olds account for half of all monthly podcast listeners, which is extraordinary if you think about it. These listeners are also younger than the overall U.S. monthly podcast audience.
And we've seen this story before. Monthly podcast listeners are more likely to be employed compared to the overall population. The same is true for Latinos. The dark blue bars represent monthly listeners, while the green represents the Latino population.
Over half of the Latino monthly podcast listeners report full-time employment. Put that together with the employed part-time, and you get 2/3 of Latino monthly podcast listeners that are somewhat employed.
And likely due to COVID-19, those metrics on temporarily unemployed are higher than we typically see it, but employment is related to income. The data shows Latino monthly podcast listeners are more likely to be in a higher income bracket compared to all U.S. Latino adults. Over half of Latino monthly listeners report a household income of $50,000 or higher. This is lower than what we're used to seeing among the overall monthly podcast listeners.
And of course, this ties back to education. We know the general monthly podcast listening audience is more likely to have a college degree, and this is also true for Latino monthly podcast listeners. We won't cover education in this webinar, but you can expect to see it when the deck is available for download later today.
And earlier in this report, we saw that 35% of the total Latino adult population is foreign-born. There's only a slight difference when you look at Latino monthly podcast listeners, but the highlight is within those born in the US. The Latino monthly podcast listener group is more likely to be in the first generation of their family that is born in the US compared to the entire Latino population.
Of course, this makes sense given how much more developed the podcast industry is here in the US and in English. This also ties back to their age because, as we know, podcast listeners tend to be younger, as do firstborn generation Latinos.
And we also ask Latinos if they consider themselves any of the following. 37% of monthly listeners consider themselves mestizo, 30% Afro-Latino, and 15% indigenous. Across the board, monthly podcast listeners are more likely to identify with any of these. And in the current shift in awareness, thanks to the Black Lives Matter movement, it would be unwise for the industry to ignore that large 30% of Latino podcast listeners who identify as Afro-Latino.
You know, I think this goes back to that common myth that we are this monolith, that the term Latino is a catch-all. And this umbrella term can really erase this diversity among us. This report being called the Latino Podcast Listener Report is on purpose because from the inception of the study, we've wanted to break open that term and make it clear to the industry that we don't all look alike, we don't speak the same language, come from the same place, and this diversity really does influence how and what we listen to.
Good point, Martina. And contrary to popular belief, we don't all come from the same place. While the majority of Latinos say their family ties back to Mexico, about half indicate that most of their family originates in other places. Peru, Colombia, Uruguay, and other countries in South America, Puerto Rico, and countries all over the Americas and Europe.
So, now that we dug into the demographics of Latino podcast listeners, let's now get into their listening metrics.
And many started listening recently. What's interesting is that 1/3 of all Latino monthly podcast listeners have started listening within the last 6 months. And that's higher than the general monthly audience. It makes sense. Last year, my colleague Tom Webster demonstrated that podcast movement, that those who started listening within the last 6 months, those we consider the rookies. They're a lot younger than the veterans who've been listening for more than 3 years. So it makes sense that the young Latino demographic would be made up of more rookies compared to the overall monthly podcast audience. It just goes to show that how much of a driver Latinos are in the growth of podcasting.
Another remarkable finding is the difference between Latinos who are Spanish dominant and Latinos who are not Spanish dominant. If you add the blue and pink sections, an overwhelming 70% of Spanish dominant monthly podcast listeners started listening within the last year. Compare that to the 47% of non-Spanish dominant monthly listeners. This shows that a large part of the growth in podcast listening over the last year among Latino monthly listeners is due to that Spanish dominant side. And this makes sense to me too, because just in the last year, we've seen a ton of growth on the content side when it comes to Spanish language podcasts. So there's way more to listen to, and it makes sense that more people would then be listening.
So those who started listening less than a year ago are technically listening more compared to last year. And those people are included in the dark blue section of the pie on the left, along with everyone else who said they've been listening more since last year. That's 4/5 of all Latino podcast listeners.
On the right, we see that over half say that they've been listening more since the outbreak of COVID-19. Only 1 in 10 say they've been listening less.
Now, the Latino podcast listeners discover podcasts a bit differently than the general podcast listening audience. Social media posts are the most popular source chosen by Latino listeners. We typically see searching the internet at a higher percentage for the general monthly listening audience. Latinos are also less likely to ever discover podcasts via advertisements on other audio programs and recommendations and advertisements on AM/FM radio stations. I think the idea that the Spanish media outlets do not promote podcasts as much as the English media has a lot to do here.
So this is a graph of those who have ever used these sources to discover podcasts. But what about the sources Latino listeners report using the most?
It goes in the same order, and it's very similar to the rookie listeners I mentioned earlier, a listener who started listening within the last 6 months. 26% say they use social media posts most often to discover podcasts, followed by the 22% that say recommendations from friends and family.
And social media is a great way to discover podcasts, especially if you're on your phone. It can be a direct path from initial discovery to the moment you hit play.
And that might be why 65% of Latinos listen to podcasts on a mobile device most often, which is similar to what we saw in the monthly podcast Consumer Report in 2019 among the total monthly listening audience. But something we didn't ask in that report that we did here was what services Latino listeners use to listen to podcasts. And we discovered that an incredible 3/4 of Latino monthly listeners ever use YouTube.
I have to say that I am so pleased to see this borne out by the data because anecdotally, this is something I've been saying for a long time, that YouTube is a major destination for audio listening among Latinos. We've seen this trend grow via a collaborative audience survey that we've been conducting via our community podcasteros in Latin America. It's called Encuesta Pod. So to see it also reflected in these numbers in the US is super valuable. Now, why so many people listen on YouTube, that's really hard to say for sure. I know that for those people who were born outside of the US, I personally saw YouTube being used for free music listening when I lived in Latin America. And given that it might be an app people already have on their phones, that could also just provide a natural progression for those who are seeking YouTube to listen to podcasts. Also, I do know that some chat shows are really popular in video format and they're recording themselves in studio. So perhaps people are discovering chat podcasts first as videos on YouTube and then moving on to the versions of those as podcasts. There's a variety of potential reasons here.
Yeah, and other than YouTube, we asked about Spotify, and that's the second most popular choice, followed by Apple Podcasts, which, by the way, we typically see higher among the general audience.
So we've seen that Latino podcast listeners prefer listening on their phones. They prefer listening on YouTube. Now, where do they listen?
Latino podcast listeners say they ever listened in these locations, and this is consistent with the overall monthly listeners in the U.S. As you would expect during COVID-19, the percentage of people that said they listened in a car or public transportation is less than what we typically see. We also force Latinos to pick which location they listen to podcasts most, and overwhelmingly, the choice for listening is at home. 71% say they listen most at home. We've seen this before. Home is usually the top pick with the general U.S. podcast audience, even before COVID-19. But your assumptions are correct if you think that the at-home percentage is higher than what we've seen pre-COVID-19.
And while Gabe says this looks similar to trends among podcast listeners and the general public, one area where we see differences is in the topics Latinos prefer to listen to.
That's correct, Martina. Some of the topics we're used to seeing in our other research are still at the top for Latinos. One third of Latino listeners in this report say they ever listen to music podcasts and comedy podcasts. 27% say they listen to TV and movie podcasts. But one key difference here is true crime. That's 18% of Latino listeners. We're used to seeing that higher in the list for the general monthly podcast audience.
Honestly, I'm not too surprised by this because at least in Spanish, there are very few, if any, true crime podcasts. But of course, to know that Latinos aren't as interested in true crime even in English is a super interesting data point. I actually wonder about how that combines with some other data collected for this report about priorities for Latinos in terms of who makes the content they listen to and how it's made.
Another highlight is news from Latin America. It's pretty far down this list on the second page. Only 13% of Latino monthly podcast listeners say they listen, but we'll show how that changes when we look at these topics on Spanish podcasts. And with music, comedy, and TV podcasts being the popular choices, it's no surprise that 70% of Latino listeners agree that entertainment is a reason for listening to podcasts. 70% also say they listen in order to learn new things, and 61% say they listen to stay up to date with the latest topics. It's important for 47% of Latino listeners that these topics include stories about and perspectives from their country of origin. We asked the question, how important is it to you that the podcasts you listen to, followed by these statements? The words country of origin in this first statement were replaced by the name of the country that respondents indicated was where most of their family was from.
And this is super interesting to me because they placed more importance on that item, but the idea of prioritizing content that had Latino hosts, Latino producers, hosted by people of color or of their own age are also still important for many Latino monthly listeners.
Yep, and so is the idea of podcast hosts who are people of color. 40% of US-born Latinos say it's very or somewhat important to them to have podcast hosts who are people of color. And we only look at that statement by those who were born in the US.
That's because the term people of color is just more commonly used here in the US, so we thought it might end up being misleading or confusing for those who weren't born here.
But the rest of the items were asked to listeners born outside of the US, and this is how their opinion differed to Latinos born in the US. You can tell that foreign-born Latinos place more importance on these items with the exception of podcasts hosts your own age. The biggest difference between those two groups are the importance of Spanish podcasts.
Which is the perfect segue into Spanish podcast listening.
Yep, and before we leap into that, just so you can have some English data as a benchmark, 84% of Latino monthly listeners have ever listened to a podcast in English.
And of all the generations, it's no surprise that those born outside of the US are the least likely to have listened to one in English.
And that 77% of Latino listeners born outside of the US surprised me a bit because the incidence is the same when you look at those who have ever listened to a podcast in Spanish.
That's right. 77% of Latino listeners born outside of the US have ever listened to a podcast in Spanish. So you could imagine that when that group is brought into the world of podcasts, they're being brought in both languages, not just Spanish.
But in this scenario with Spanish podcasts, foreign-born Latinos are the most likely of the bunch to have listened. Out of Latino monthly podcast listeners, 63% say they have ever listened to a podcast in Spanish. We showed these out of the total in the beginning, but these numbers are different. They're different because they are among Latino monthly podcast listeners.
So you can see as you get further into generations born in the US, Spanish podcast listening begins to deteriorate. Of course, this is tied to language ability and dominance. Many people know the language of the immigrant generation begins to fade from generation to generation for any group of people that come into the US. Latinos are obviously no exception. Despite all of this, 63% is still a good chunk of Latino listeners. This is actually a number that surprised me a bit.
It's a good chunk, and 14% of Latino listeners say that all of the podcasts they listen to are in Spanish. If you add that to the green, 34% say that most of their podcasts are in Spanish. Add that to the red, and 48%, about half of all Latino monthly listeners, say that at least half of the podcasts they listen to are in Spanish, which is one of our key findings. These quantities are largely driven by the Spanish dominant group, and it's linked to their strong weekly listenership, which again is not a small-time achievement for a group that lacks awareness of the term podcasting.
So Spanish as a language is as diverse as Latinos themselves, and we wanted to ask about that in the survey as well. It turns out 97% of US Latino monthly podcast listeners who have ever listened to a podcast in Spanish have listened to one where the accent was different than their own. I was particularly interested in this because there's a lot of debate about whether people are open to listening to content in an accent that isn't theirs. It came up a lot when we were creating NPR's Radio Ambulante with my co-founders of that show. And it's just so nice to see this idea so clearly torn down by this figure and this next one we're about to show you.
It's very nice indeed. And among these 97%, 42% say a different Spanish accent is more interesting to them. Another 42% say it really doesn't matter to them, and only 16% say it bothers them.
So we've been only looking at those that have ever listened to a podcast in Spanish, but now let's look at regular listeners. 52% of Latino monthly listeners have listened to a podcast in English in the last week. 31% have listened to a podcast in Spanish in the last week.
And by adding listen to within the last week, within the last month, those sections in dark blue and green, you get 73% of Latino monthly listeners that have listened to an English podcast within the last month. The monthly reach for Spanish podcasts among this group is 49%. So half of all Latino monthly listeners.
I have to say this 49% figure is higher than I expected, and it's really promising, given how new that side of the industry is still. And not only new in terms of the content available, but it's also new in terms of listeners. As we mentioned earlier, 44% of Spanish-dominant Latinos have started listening in the last 6 months.
Yeah, and if maybe we had done this survey 6 months ago or a year ago, this 49% you see in front of you would be different. It's a pretty solid number, and it's something the market needs to start paying attention to.
And the Spanish podcasts, this 49% like to listen to, are a little different than what we saw earlier in the overall listening among all Latino monthly podcast listeners.
Music and comedy are still the most popular podcast choices on Spanish podcasts. You see a slight drop for TV and movies, and remember that percentage for news from Latin America and the overall Latino listener group? That was 12%. But on Spanish language podcasts, that shoots up to 20%. International news also sees a bump to the top 3, indicating that news sources are important for Spanish podcasts.
And check out that true crime is nowhere on this page. And here it's more clearly because of lack of offering. As I said earlier, there are just not that many produced yet in Spanish.
There are differences in topics here, and there are differences in the services that are used to listen to podcasts in Spanish.
Again, YouTube is the top pick for Latino listeners for where to consume podcasts in any language. 28% say they use it most often for podcast listening, 21% say Spotify, and 12% say Apple Podcasts.
And the bottom strip are the preferred services for specifically Spanish podcast listening. You can see right away that Spanish podcasts are consumed by a greater percentage of people on YouTube. There's less importance placed on Apple Podcasts, and the other number you see here indicates that Spanish podcasts are being consumed in less mainstream ways. They have to seek out different methods of consuming Spanish podcasts, just like they have to seek out Spanish podcasts to find content that they can't find in English.
That's one of the reasons over half of Latino Spanish podcast listeners give for seeking out Spanish language podcasts, that the content isn't available in English. 57% agree that they feel more connected to hosts who speak Spanish in their podcasts. But we should point out that for the 56% who say they seek out Spanish podcasts because Spanish is their dominant language, that's less of a choice. It's, because it's their dominant language. 56% also agree that they listen because it includes stories about and perspectives from Latinos.
And remember how we showed that Spanish podcast listening fades in further generations of US-born Latinos? Well, those later generations who listen to podcasts in Spanish are more likely to agree with the last item here, that they listen because they want to preserve or improve your Spanish language skills.
This is super important for Spanish podcast creators because if they want to hold on to Latinos in the US, they need to understand the specific value for those Latinos who are losing hold of their Spanish and therefore losing interest in Spanish language content, as we saw in an earlier slide.
In a sense, one might say Spanish podcasts can be their own saviors.
Absolutely. So we want to end with the key takeaways of the report.
Today, we learned that the majority of Latinos have only started listening to podcasts within the last year, and yet are still unfamiliar with the term. Those who make an effort to reach out to Latinos will surely benefit from the fact that their share of time spent listening to podcasts is already higher than that of the general population. Add that to the upside that we see in the monthly listenership, you see the full picture. Latinos have been and will continue to be essential for the sustained growth of podcast listening.
The report also shows what a diverse group is represented under the term Latino in the US. It's a group that spans various generations, languages, racial and cultural identities, and countries of origin. Listening habits do break down very differently depending on language dominance. That's something to keep note of. But all Latinos value content that includes stories and perspectives about Latinos. As we discussed, this content has potential in both English and Spanish.
So thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. A recording of this webinar and a copy of a full report will be available on edisonresearch.com immediately after we finish. A big thank you to all our partners on the report: Adonde Media, Lantigua Williams Company, Libsyn, NPR, and Pandora. And especially to you, Martina, for all your work and for lending your voice and perspective to this webinar.
You're very welcome, and thank you so much for having me. This report is such a game changer in our industry and has in many ways been years in the making. It really took this set of partners for this moment to be possible, so thank you to all of you, and a special shout out to Jaleka Lantigua Williams, who helped bring us together.
And we at Edison are very proud to be a part of it. You know, I may have delivered the data, but there were so many people working so hard behind the scenes to make this all happen. Don't forget to catch our next webinar about music discovery on July 16th. Once again, thank you everyone for your time.
And gracias por escuchar.